Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS Summer Split Week number 1 overview and analysis video. We are back with the LCS. It's the final major region to get a week number 1 here at the start of the Summer Split, and I could not be more excited to talk about it. There are some really interesting storylines going into the Summer Split. Some teams made small changes, some teams made big changes. Shout out Dignitas. And I really do think we're going to be getting a little bit of a different look in the LCS here in summer as compared to spring, especially because this is the debut of the best of 3 format. And so we are going from best of 1s to best of 3s. That means we have significantly less to talk about across the entire week. We're not going to be going game by game like we normally would be. We're going to go series by series as we do for the LCK and the LPL. I think it just makes more sense in terms of going over these series in a simple manner. And so you're probably going to get a bit of a shorter video because we're spending, 8 or so minutes on each series, but hope you guys are okay with the change. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Of course, if you want to know what my thoughts were on these teams going into this week, going into the summer split in general, check out the video up in the iCard. That's my primer for the LCS here in the summer split. We go over all 8 teams, every single starting player. I rank the teams, I rank the players, I grade the players. I talk about everything in that video. So if you haven't checked it out, I really do recommend it before watching this one. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We also will, of course, be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10. Only one series for each team means we don't really have a ton to go off of. It's going to be a little bit difficult. Everybody's only played 1 day worth of games, and so there's not really a great, sign as to where these teams are moving, but at the very least, we get to see if they continue their form from spring or change it up going into summer. So that's the preamble out of the way. Let's get into the analysis itself, and that means starting off with day number 1. And as is typical here in the LCS, we kick off day number 1 of week number 1 with a rematch of the finals from the previous split, and that holds true here. It's Team Liquid taking on FlyQuest, and just like in the finals, Team Liquid is going to pick up the win. There was conversation and talk about whether or not Team Liquid should unanimously be the number 1 team in everybody's power rankings. I think there are arguments to be made that they should be number 1. I made some of those arguments in the primer, even though I put them at number 2. I think those arguments include they just won, and obviously it's really hard to look at the champions who leveled up over the course of the split and not say they're on the right trajectory, but also historical evidence would show that traditionally coming back from MSI is a super good thing for North American teams, at least in terms of recent history. You look at last year, a team like Golden Guardians, who was incredibly strong after their MSI run. They were much better as a team in summer than they were in spring, at least across the entire year, even if they didn't finish as well in the playoffs. And then the year before, you look at someone like an Evil Geniuses, who was a good team in the spring, was a good team in the regular season, went on that big playoff run, went to MSI, and came back and dominated the regular season. Were by far the best team in the regular season in summer. So MSI has kind of proven to be a big positive for teams, especially teams that do well at the tournament or gain confidence at the tournament, and Team Liquid was definitely one of those, and they kind of proved that they can carry a lot of that confidence over in this series. It wasn't perfect from them. I really don't like how they played game number 2. They gave over way too many things to a comp that just scales super freely, but games 1 and 3 were pretty stock standard. Game 3 in particular, really, really clean from TL. Player of the series is going to go to APA for me. He wasn't the only one I considered, but he certainly was the one who I think dominated the most. He has really grown into being one of the more consistent mid laners in the LCS, which is a little bit shocking, at least for me, because consistency really wasn't ever a strength of APA's, even at lower levels. One of the things that really made him a really interesting prospect was the highs that you would get from him. Just game to game, you would also get some variance. He is a little bit of a risky player. He's not afraid to go out there and try to make plays in the 1v1 or try to make plays in the 3v3 around objectives if they do want to skirmish in that way. But one of the things he has really gotten better at is making sure that he is always in a position to help out the rest of his team and to capitalize when they set him up, which they do super frequently. APA has really just become a very solid mid laner for Liquid. I know some people were frustrated with how low he came in my mid lane rankings. He is ostensibly about as equal as like number 3 or number 4 in the mid lane rankings, or even number 2 if everything were to go right. Like, there's not a huge gap in terms of the middle of the pack mid laners or even like the upper tier mid laners right now in the LCS. APA very much is a part of that, especially with the growth that he has shown. I think Yon and Core really looked great in this series. They continue their strength in lane. The Dragon in the bot lane, Smolder in game number 1. I don't think we're going to see a ton of that because Smolder is just in such a weak state right now, but things got a little bit better on the Zeri in game number 3. Really like when this team wants to put pressure onto the late game team fighting, aspect of the game, because they are so good early early just naturally as players, that it gives them that kind of insurance policy. I've talked about it a lot on this channel, and Yon core continuing to do that. Core was really good in this series. Impact was really good in the games that they won, was really bad in game number 2 on the Zac, but was really good in game 3. Like, he obliterated Bwipo on this set. The Rumble was unstoppable. That laning phase was a complete disaster. Even in game number 1, there were problems. FlyQuest just didn't adapt to these lane swaps particularly well, even with support coming in from Masu. In that first game, Bwipo was just kind of bad, and Impact was just kind of better. So that's really good to see for Liquid. Again, not entirely surprising, but Bwipo was one of the more consistent players in the regular season last split. So big to see him, kind of get trounced in the first series here. And then was fine as well. Certainly not going to complain about his performance. Team Liquid just looked very versatile. They looked very complete as a team, and that's all you really want to see from them. You want to see them be able to play the same kind of game that they were able to win the LCS finals with: calm, controlled chaos, and be able to get early leads, be able to translate that into wins, and not really have to worry too much. I think that is a really good strategy for Liquid, and they did it here. So, and then we get to talk about FlyQuest on the other side of this. Not nearly as good for Fly. Quite a bit of problems in this series. I think, unfortunately, chief among them being the top side of this map, which is supposed to be kind of your rock. They were so good in the regular season for Fly last split. They're players that I really trust. Bwipo and Inspired have been really consistent, and I think when you look at the KDAs of the teams in this series, like Inspired's KDA looks really good because he had a good game on Karthus, and he didn't int as much as the others in the other 2 games, and Bwipo, well, he had the most deaths. Like, he contributed in a lot of the, plays that they wanted to make. I think if you just looked at those stats, they honestly wouldn't look all that bad, but that completely ignores a lot of the story of this series, which is Bwipo getting kind of destroyed by Impact in pretty pivotal moments, specifically in that third and final game, and Inspired just AFK farming. Like, that was a big problem that this team ran into, and I know Inspired kind of can sometimes default to being a late game kind of jungler, right? Like, if you're going to look at his style, if you're going to look at the way that he personally likes to approach the game, he's always been somebody who really thrives in 5v5 team fights. He's always been somebody who loves to control objectives, maybe the most of anybody in the West, and that has really helped teams that he has been on be consistent, because you can pretty consistently get to the late stage of games in the West, in the LEC, in the LCS. You're not getting pressured out of games in the early game nearly as much as you would against teams in the LCK and the LPL, just stylistically, and so you can kind of, slow the pace down and get to that stage a bit more, and he is just the best at that stage of the game. But Team Liquid's a team that's really good at speeding up the pace of the game because their players are so adept at that, and so FlyQuest really struggled. Inspired really didn't have a big impact on this game. He was often just missing for a lot of these fights, but Bwipo was actively losing, which is why he's going to get dead of the series on the top side. Again, Impact was just significantly better. That set game in game 3 was not good. Even the Rumble in game 1, I think, had its own problems, and so Fly really needs to clean up some of their things. It feels like Team Liquid's just a very bad matchup for them, this early game team that wants to pressure them quickly, going into this team that does like to scale a little bit more consistently. So definitely frustrating for the top side, but how did Quad do on his debut? He was fine. He didn't really show up or show out or anything like that. He just kind of existed in the mid lane. I see a lot of people talking like, oh, well, why did you replace Jensen with Quad if Quad is just going to come in and be Jensen for this team? And I think Quad has a different kind of, play style to Jensen. I think they play similar champions. We've seen that brought up in a lot of conversations of like, oh, Quad just plays a lot of mages and he plays a lot of team fighters and, things like Orianna and Cassiopeia and whatever, right? Like all of these Jensen picks. And it's like, what really is the difference between Jensen and Quad? But I think the difference is that they play those champions very differently. Jensen really likes to just kind of farm up, play a little bit safer, will be willing to give over resources to help out his jungle. And for the most part, it's just going to be kind of a secure team fighter, doesn't really want to carry. Whereas Quad does want to take those champions and gain a lot of resources and carry with them. Quad a lot less likely to push and shove and roam. Like, he's not a roamer. He's never really been super high in terms of like jungle proximity. That's just never really been something that Quad has been great at. He's never been somebody that's played for his jungle, whereas Jensen does. But Quad is also a lot more adept at actively being able to be the number one option on a team. And so I think those really are the differences, even if they are playing similar champions. I think we've seen kind of discussion surrounding this being, oh, Quad's come in to help fix the communication because Inspired wanted to play with somebody that wanted to, be more aggressive. And I think it does fit if Quad is going to play a lot more aggressive in the early game. It does allow Inspired to kind of be a little bit more of that scaler if they do want to go that route. The problem is Quad didn't really win in this matchup, and that's really essential. He has to be mechanically talented or at least more mechanically talented than his opposition in order for this to work. So something to continue to monitor. Masu and Busio were fine. I think Masu actually played the Senna really well. I just don't think it ended up mattering. Lane swaps are boring. But for FlyQuest, there are real issues. I'm not going to give up on this team because they lost to the defending champions. That would be a crazy thing to do, but it does feel like they have a particularly bad matchup into a lot of the good teams in the LCS, and they certainly didn't inspire a lot of confidence with how MSI went. So certainly some things to figure out, but for Team Liquid, they just continued right where they left off. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this team just kind of cruised through the regular season, if they end up being the number one seed super comfortably, even if I don't have them number one right now in my power rankings. I think a lot of that optimism comes from how well they played at MSI, the confidence that they carry. I don't think they have the highest upside of any team here in the LCS, which is why I am concerned about them being just labeled as the number one team, but at least for now, it does seem like they have the highest floor. Then moving on now to Series 2 of day number 1, and it's another upper table clash here between Cloud9 and Dignitas, and Cloud9 is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, both of the first best of threes here on day number 1, going to 3 games. That's exactly what you want to see if you are an LCS fan. Both of them were super competitive, but this one was just a blast to watch. Whether or not you think it was the cleanest League of Legends of all time, this was an awesome series and super, super fun from a viewer perspective. I think the gameplay was actually really good as well. A couple of really good performances coming out from both sides of the map. I honestly don't think anybody in this series was particularly bad. I think both teams really had a lot of advantages. I think the only time you can sit here and say a team was really playing poorly was Cloud9 in game number 1, but they bounced back in games 2 and 3 to look really good, even if their mid game still is incredibly shaky. So we'll talk about it. Player of the series for me, maybe a bit controversially, is going to go to Blabber in the jungle. Now, I get it. That Nidalee game in game number 1 was horrendous. I'm not going to try and defend that. He was the worst player in that game. That was probably the worst game anybody had across this entire series, but when you look at games 2 and 3, I think he solo won them for Cloud9. Like, obviously, credit in the world to Berserker, who I will talk about in a second. He was the damage carry on the Zeri and the Kai'Sa in the back half of this series. He looked really comfortable, and honestly, if he's going to play the way that he did, Cloud9 is going to be just fine, even with their mid-game mistakes, but Blabber's pathing is genuinely just ridiculous. First of all, he was genuinely unkillable in game number 2. Really, he's getting player of the series for game 2 on the Sejuani, where I thought he played about as perfectly as you can as a frontliner. This is like the quintessential how to play Sejuani game. I mean, he had Warmogs and Ocean Soul. He could literally never die in that second game. It was really impressive, but the ability to generate leads, even on tanks going into things like Vi, it's really impressive. His ability to just gather resources and constantly be ahead in terms of timers. He looks at the game differently than other junglers from North America, and it's the reason why he's so consistently at the top of the standings every single year. I get it, he has good teammates around him, but this is an MVP caliber player. He's arguably the most valuable player in the LCS, and even on things like Sejuani and Maokai, that comes through. The aggressiveness and the innovation does kind of come through from Blabber. He has to clean up the mid-game mistakes. It's always going to be, kind of a big problem for him. He's going to be out of position at one time in the mid-game, but as an early and late-game fighter, he's really good in those roles. Thanatos was correct when he talked about his little funny quote on the C9 podcast where he said Blabber before 15 minutes is Canyon. After that, well, I don't have anything to say. Like, that's kind of the truth, right? Is Blabber pre-15 minutes is the best jungler in the world, and then, he's got to figure things out. But front to back, he's also really good, especially on tanks. And so for Blabber, I think he's going to be just fine. This was a really good series from him. Berserker does deserve that shout out for being the damage carry in a lot of these fights, specifically in games 2 and 3, which were incredibly good. Sven was fine on the other side of this matchup, had a couple of problems down the stretch of this series, wasn't perfect in game number 3, but Berserker was better, and he was excellent. Again, if this team's going to have mid-game problems, Berserker can fix that purely by getting super far ahead in the early game, by being a great laner and by knowing how to transition those leads. Even if the rest of the team isn't super cohesive in following up on it, we know he's good enough to be able to push them forward in that stage. He is a big turning point for this team. Vulcan was generally fine. That's all he really needs to be. He was a problem last split, was not a problem in this series. Jojo took a more backseat role to Talia. Very strong in this series. We'll talk about Jensen in a second, but I like Jojo. He can be a carry, he can be a support kind of player, he can do whatever you need him to do. I think he's the best player in the LCS at the current moment, although I think it's up for debate. And then Thanatos, as a debut in the top side, generally fine, didn't really get to do a whole ton. I think he got better as this series went along. Game 3 on the Renekton was probably his most complete experience, and generally he was better in Game 2 as well, but he still has a lot of things that I think he needs to clean up. I'm lower on Thanatos, I always have been. Talked about this a lot when I was talking about the LCK. People were praying for this guy to start for Damwon in the LCK, and, I'd always always talked about it on this channel where it's like, yeah, he's good, but I don't see like this unbelievable prospect. Like he is certainly somebody that I think could come to North America and just be more talented than everybody else, but he is not a surefire like home run. It's why I didn't rank him as such in terms of my, prospect rankings. I don't think he's as good of a prospect as Berserker was coming into the league. I think this was a general expected result for me in terms of his debut, but for Cloud9, you were able to win, and honestly, that's all that really matters. Dig is a little bit inconsistent right now, but you played well. Cloud9 did a lot of really good things. I think some of it's going to get overlooked because their mid games are sloppy, but there are a lot of positives to take away from this series as well. And then for Dignitas on the other side, this was a good series from them as well, especially considering the fact that Spica goes on pros and talks about how they've been losing every single scrim that they have. They are not doing well in that stage of the game. They're a pretty new team, especially in comparison to the communication that every other roster in this league has. They're just not going to be able to keep up. They are the, most different roster. There's nobody on this team who played with each other last split, so it's a lot of rebuilding communication, but this was pretty good for a first time. Jensen and Sven in particular had a couple of really good moments. Jensen was awesome in this series. Hopefully he can continue to step up and be a positive, just like he was for FlyQuest, and I thought Spica actually was kind of underratedly good here. I think the Sejuani in game number 3 was generally fine. Unfortunately, someone has to get done of the series, and that for me is going to go to Isles. He was just the player who was the least consistent, I would say, throughout the series, and really especially wanted to see more on the Recon in game number 2. That's mostly the game that he is getting this for, rather than the Braum or the Nautilus, where I thought he was generally fine. I think some people might want to give this to Licorice in the top lane, but he was too important in game number 3. I think if the communication had been better, if he was a bit earlier to some of these fights, if he had been able to actually join up with the rest of his team for some of these 5v5s. I think Dig actually makes game 3 a lot closer, and so for that, it's really hard for me to give him dud of the series because I do think he was valuable there, but he was not good in game number 2 at all, where he was a bit of a problem. So Dig looking a little bit ahead of schedule, at least in my opinion. I expected Cloud9 to be able to win this, and I still think they have the highest ceiling of any team in the LCS, but Dig did a good job of being able to keep up with them, take a game off of them, and look relatively in their own element. I think this is a top 4 team, and I think they could compete for a world spot if the first series is anything to go off of. And for C9, it's not perfect. They still have a lot of the core issues that they had in the spring split, but they are just more talented now. They have a lot more ways to get out of those situations because of the pure talent. I think Blabber is going to be just fine. I'm not worried about JoJo. If Berserker is going to step back up to where he was even halfway before last split, if Thanatos comes in as an upgrade in the top lane, which I think is super doable, Cloud9 should just be able to win more games off of their skill gap alone. Then moving on now to day number 2 here, and day number 2 is for the teams that I have in the bottom 4 of my power rankings. Kind of funny how that ended up working out. I'm sure they did it on purpose, but kicking off day number 2 was a matchup between 100 Thieves and NRG that 100 Thieves is able to take incredibly convincingly. This series was not close. This was not like the 2 series that we covered earlier today, where both teams kind of felt like they at least put something out there to, kind of hang your hat on. NRG played 2 games this week, and both of them were pretty horrible for them. 100 Thieves absolutely obliterate them. It wasn't even particularly close. I think some people might look at this as a pretty massive draft gap, and yeah, I think that there is certainly some merit to saying that. I think that there is a lot more consistency on the side of 100 Thieves, but there are also a lot of things going wrong for 100 Thieves draft that I just don't think works all that much. I don't think either team really drafted excellently. Energy might have been a bit worse in terms of the synergy that they had, but 100 Thieves execution is so much better. Their players know what they're doing so much more right now that they were pretty clearly able to walk to this victory. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to Quid in the mid lane, the reigning MVP. Starts off this split just as he finished the last one, at least in the regular season. He is completely dominating. He looks excellent. I moved him all the way up as my number 2 mid laner heading into the split, only behind JoJo Pune, who just has a little bit of a longer track record, but Quid was so unbelievable last split. There's really no reason to believe he can't go out and repeat that kind of performance. Mechanically speaking, we know he's talented enough to be able to carry games, and 100 Thieves as a unit is so adept at being able to get him the resources he needs to do that. One of my biggest issues with Quid as a player has always been that it doesn't really feel like he is very good as a second piece. He kind of has to be the primary option on the team that he's on. He's a very big resource carry, but luckily for him on 100 Thieves, that's exactly how they are set up. Meech and Alo were playing a lot of weak side bot last year. They didn't do that as much here in game number 1 or series number 1, but it was fine. River obviously loves playing for mid lane. He loves giving resources to the middle of the map, and Sniper doesn't really need a lot of assistance on the top side. He loves to get isolated matchups and play 1v1. 1v1. So Quid is really in his element, getting a lot of jungle assistance and playing for a lot of the 2v2s early on, and he's just so good in the 1v1. He's so good when he doesn't have to worry so much about everything else in the game, and he can just focus on his own individual performance. He really does play at a super high level in that situation, and that's exactly what we've seen from him. Again, the team is set up perfectly to enable his strengths and to hide his weaknesses. He never really has to do a lot of the things that he's not particularly good at, and that's really what you want to do for a player like Quid, and who is one of the best players in the league when he is rolling. So, obviously I would be remiss to not talk about the Ezreal mid. He was really good on Ezreal mid. This is a tech that we've seen, kind of in the LCK Challengers League. We've, I've heard about it in Korean solo queue. Like, this has been brought up a couple of times. I'm shocked that someone had the balls to pull it out on their first game of the split, but, kind of a low stakes opportunity now. Like, I think teams are going to be more willing to pull out random stuff in 1 or 2 games in the middle of the split because it is a best of 3. If you lose it, you don't get that loss on your full record. Like, it doesn't count as much, quite frankly, towards your overall record each individual game. So pulling out the Ezreal mid in game number 1 and dominating on it, it's really fun to see. But generally speaking, it was pretty traditional for Quid. Outside of that, Meech was unbelievably good here. I think as a late game carry, his team fighting is exceptional. One of my concerns about Meech was just the inconsistency again coming up from the Challengers League. When you looked at the NACL performance of Meech, he would have some unbelievable games, and especially when the team was playing for him, he would look really good. But when he was targeted, especially early on in games, he would struggle. The inconsistency from game to game would definitely be there. He's really been a completely different player at the LCS level. Again, last split, he played a lot of weak side, was playing a lot of Senna. That was really kind of the strategy that 100 Thieves wanted to go to because Quid was such a resource carry for them. They are more willing to go to, I think, some team fighters now because that's kind of where the meta has moved towards. Things like Kai'Sa and Jinx and, even things like Smolder, even if they're a bit weaker, those are going to be the most prominent picks, at least clearly here in the LCS. And I think Meech fits that style a little bit better in terms of what I saw from him in the NACL. And he looked awesome here in the first series, completely outplayed FBI and Huhi. Ayla was also really good as an engager, but Meech was definitely kind of the star coming out of that bot lane duo. Sniper was good. River was fine. I'm still not a huge fan of Zyra. I really don't think that pick does nearly as much as, a lot of people make it out to be. Maybe I'm just underestimating it. Like, really good objective control, unbelievable clear, like probably the fastest in the entire game. I'm sure you can get it to some record-setting time if you really optimized it. It is a bit random because of where the plants spawn, but, you can get pretty consistent in terms of clearing quickly with Zyra. I just don't think she skirmishes all that well, and I think there are a lot of champions in the game right now that could theoretically punish it. It's just teams aren't really going for that. They're going for things like, Maokai or Sejuani, and then defaulting to their aggressive jungle pick being Nidalee, which is not really working in the LCS right now, which we will obviously talk about. And Zyra does really well into those specific matchups so long as the Nidalee doesn't start snowballing the rest of her team out of control. And we'll talk about why that was never the case for Energy here. Sniper was fine, River was fine, but Quid was the star, and Meech was very much up there with him. This was an awesome series from the 2 carries out of 100 Thieves, and if they can keep that up, they are going to replicate their second place finish from the regular season last split. And then for Energy on the other side, just a lack of cohesion. Their problems continue to be there. The individual skill of this team has gone down tremendously. I don't really know what's going on. I think the draft certainly doesn't help things. Nidalee plus Corki Kai'Sa is just a very weird way to play the game. Like, you want Nidalee to be moving around on the map and, creating a lot of this pressure early, but she doesn't really have any winning lanes. Like, Cassante into Camila is not going to win. Corki into Tristana is not going to win, and Kai'Sa Braum into Jinx Leona is not going to win. So where exactly is Nidalee supposed to go with this pressure? There just isn't really a lot of situations for her. That being said, Contracts is going to get done of the series because he was really bad here. He individually also made some pretty crucial mistakes. We know he can be a bit inconsistent, but this was not a very good debut. I think the solo laners were a concern last split. Dokla and Palafox had their own individual problems. Dokla, probably the most active player on Energy, at least throughout this series, but Palafox continuing to struggle. Quid was just quite frankly better than him in the 1v1. He really didn't have an answer to that. Ezreal in game 1 in the Corki clearly was just not going to be able to do anything in game number 2. FBI and Huhi also got outplayed. Meech was by far the best player in the bot lane, as I said. Ayla not super far behind him. Energy just looked completely disoriented. They did not look like a good team here, and I'm going to take that into account. The issues that they had towards the end of the split last spring, at the end of spring, they're still there. Clearly, this team is not just going to figure it out. Now, if there is a saving grace, it's that Energy traditionally, and these players traditionally, are not fast starters. They're not hot starters. When you look at their track record, their history as, a group, especially Dokla, Contracts, Palafox, kind of the core here of the CLG Energy kind of team, they are really bad at the start of splits. They often, kind of peak as we continue to move along. And so going to be interesting to see where things end up going for Energy, but not a great start. And then for 100 Thieves, this is about as good of a start as you could ask for. They dominated both games, and Energy's not like Shopify. They're not Immortals. They're not one of these teams that just don't have the mechanical ceiling to keep up with a team like 100 Thieves. This is a team that is mechanically talented. You were just way better than them, and that's a good sign. I'm not going to go overboard and say that this is going to be a Worlds contender, because I do think that there are a lot of things that this team has to prove in terms of who they can beat, especially after their playoff run, but at least for now, this is about as good of a way to start as you could possibly get. And then to round out week number 1, we've got what was presumed to be a bottom of the table clash here between Immortals and Shopify Rebellion. That Immortals is going to pick up a 2-0 win, and in both of these games look pretty good for Immortals. There is a lot of reason to be optimistic after seeing their first performance here, but it is important to keep the context in mind. Not only are they a team that is kind of inherently inconsistent because of the players that they have. Players like Mask and Tactical and even Ole are very flippy. Armeo, very flippy from game to game. You could get good, you could get bad performances out of them that you can be happy about. But also, they're going into Shopify Rebellion, who is kind of showing themselves to be probably the weakest team in the league, at least at the current moment, especially after this loss. Things are just not working out for them. It's really unfortunate because there are a lot of players on this team that I really like, but this was not a good start to the split. Losing to Immortals 2-0 in pretty convincing fashion is about worst case scenario as you could possibly get for a team like Shopify. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. But starting with Immortals, player of the series is pretty no-brainer, going to go to Tactical in this one. This is one of the most prototypical Tactical performances that you are ever going to get. He got snowballing out of control, and he was just never going to get stopped. Game 1, Game 2, both of them looked very good. Tactical has always been the kind of player that just absolutely abuses bad teams, that abuses bad positioning because his aggressiveness is not something that a lot of these teams are used to playing against at the LCS level. Tactical is going to be super aggro. He is going to step up in your face. That's very famous about him. That is going to be a bit more of a problem against teams that don't have as many weaknesses, but against a team like Shopify, he can take advantage of their mistakes more so than almost any other AD carry in the league just because of the way that he wants to play the game. So he's going to have performances like this. I'm not trying to shit on Tactical. I'm not trying to say that this performance isn't entirely replicable. I do think that this performance is replicable moving into the future. I just think that, Tactical's playstyle does inherently require the enemy team to be a bit less prepared for it, or at least a bit less mechanical, make more mistakes is the way that I'll put it, than maybe some of the other more consistent play styles in the league. But when Tactical is able to win in the bot lane, when he's able to get snowballing, he's just as good as any other AD carry in the entire league. He is top tier in terms of late game team fighting from an advantage in the LCS. It's just always been about getting that advantage cleanly. I like Tactical. I'm not trying to be negative. He's the best player on this team, and he showed that again. Ole was also fine. Ole is going to be another one of those players who's really good from an advantage state and really bad when he has to play from behind. He's good on Nautilus, good communicator, but mostly he's going to be here to make sure Tactical can get rolling, and that's not always going to be Ole's specialty, but when it works, it does work well. Armeo was really good this series. He receives a lot of flack from the community. I think Armeo is a player that would look better on a good team and looks really bad when he's on a bad team. It's just kind of the way that it is. He's the kind of player that will play to the skill level of the teammates around him. I think him similar to someone like Ignar in that respect, but this was a very good performance. Was able to completely control the jungle matchup, especially when Tomio went to something more aggressive like the Nidalee. Didn't really have a lot of outs in that, and Armeo made it look really, really punishing. Nidalee does not look good right now in the LCS. It very much feels like a bait pick unless you are really good at the champion. Mask was really good, and Castle got Skarner 2 games in a row. What are we doing here for Shopify? Fake God opting into that Rumble Skarner matchup 2 games in a row really cost them. I mean, they had absolutely no answer to Skarner in the late game, and there was really no way for Shopify to ever be competitive in that stage because of that. So very much a giant mistake, and Arrow coming in and being the coach for this team clearly has helped them. I'm not going to say that it's completely changed the outlook of this team because they still are, on pace to be a bottom 2 team. They just are better than Shopify, and that could put them number 7. Theoretically, that could put them top 6. It's going to be a fun, interesting race to watch, but Immortals certainly look more interesting, at least in this first series, than they did at any point in the spring split. And then for Shopify on the other side, this is just a bad team. Like, they play below the talent level of everybody on it. This should not be a team that is competing for last place in the LCS, but yet here we are. They are not good enough. Dud of the series is going to go to Fake God, like I said, opting into that Rumble Skarner matchup 2 games in a row is disastrous. I don't know if that was his decision or Revan's decision or whoever it was, but it was a disaster. It really was not a good call, and it really cost Shopify. Fake God has not been good at the LCS level. There is just nothing else left to say. This guy has dominated tier 2 for so many years, and basically every opportunity he's been given in the LCS has not looked looked particularly good outside of maybe that like first stint on 100 Thieves way back in the day, but that team was way better. And so I don't really know. Fake God is just someone that I'm taking okay, well, we're going to I need to see it now. Like the optimism for me has run a bit dry. The rest of this team didn't play particularly well either. Tomio and Zeyzal in particular not looking good. The 3 promotions from tier 2 not looking strong right now. Tomio just did not have a very good debut. When you're getting out jungled by Armeo, that's not a good sign. And then Zeyzal was just not relevant here on the rel. I do want to give credit to B-Voy, who continues to be the heart, the soul, and the life of Shopify Rebellion. He would be a lot more interesting if he was on a different team, but it doesn't matter if he gets early leads. He just isn't able to ever convert it into anything because his team never has any sort of map pressure. They lose way too consistently in the middle of the map. And Insanity also wasn't particularly good here on the Corki. You know, I'm not going to say that he was horrible. He didn't make any sort of egregious errors on the Corki. It just wasn't a very proactive series from him. 2 games of Corki is not really going to be able to do a whole ton. So Shopify, I'm not going to say looking inept. I'm not going to say that they look horrible. I'm going to say they look like the worst team in the LCS, though. It's one game. It's one series. Like, I'm not going to try to overreact. Perhaps they figure things out. Perhaps Tomio levels up as he continues to play more. But at least for now, a move that I really thought was going to be good for Shopify moving forward has really not looked good, at least in the first series. And then for Immortals, cool. Like, I'm glad they won. It's really good that they're not the worst team in the LCS, at least at the current moment. I don't know how high this takes them. Again, I think they still need to prove a lot before I believe that they're going to be a top 6 team. And I know that top 6 is just not bottom 2, but it's hard for me to believe that Immortals isn't going to be a bottom 2 team with the construction of the roster they have. It's all, you know, sunshine and rainbows to beat Shopify Rebellion, but you got to be able to beat teams like 100 Thieves and Energy and, you know, teams in that section of the standings in order for me to really believe that you're going to be a top 6 team. I think it's possible. I think anybody in the LCS could absolutely be a top 6 team, including Shopify, if everything continues to, you know, level up for them. But Immortals with, again, about as good of a showing as you could give in week number 1. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS Week 1 overview and analysis video. I know it's kind of a short and sweet video, but again, only 4 series to cover, and so the LCS is going to turn into one of the more digestible videos of the week here on the channel. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated LCS standings after 1 week of action. You know, at most of these teams play 3 games, and so we don't really have a great idea of where they land, but we can go ahead and go over the standings, and we're going to go over the power rankings as well. You can see my power rankings on the right of every single team's column. Power ranking is going to list where I have them between number 1 and number 8 in my personal power rankings, and change is going to be how that has changed from the preseason to now, whether they're going up or down after week number 1. So we can talk about the risers and the fallers. I think the first thing that people are going to notice is that there really aren't a lot of changes. I'm going to be a little bit safer. I always have been on this channel. That's definitely something that longtime viewers are going to be more accustomed to. I just don't think 2 to 3 games is enough to really judge whether or not a team is going to keep this kind of pace up. And so at least for now, I do want to take into account that, you know, some of these results definitely change to where I think these teams land, but not by enough to shift them up or down a full tier, at least in my opinion. So, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 all staying the same. 1 and 2 won this week. 3 and 4 lost this week to 1 and 2. And so I really don't feel a huge need to move them around. Cloud9's going to stay at number 1, if only because, again, I still think they have the highest ceiling of any team in the LCS, even if Team Liquid has by far the highest floor, and I would expect them to do better in the regular season. FlyQuest and Dig didn't show enough for me to do anything other than keep them at 3 and 4. These are teams that I expect to be just fine, or at least they need to prove that they are not just fine against other teams that aren't Cloud9 and Team Liquid, in my opinion. But everybody else is going to move somewhere. 100 Thieves, of course, going to leapfrog Energy. By beating them, they're going to move up to number 5. They could continue to move up if they continue to stay consistent in the way that they are. And then Energy, of course, moving down to 6. They could continue to move down into the bottom 2 if they play as bad as they did this week. And then Immortals going to jump up to 7. Shopify going to drop down to 8. I still think these are the teams that I would expect to finish in the bottom 2 just in terms of roster construction. But Shopify, very clearly the worst team in the league. Immortals more than deserves to jump above them. I think Immortals theoretically could get into the top 6 as soon as next week if everything goes right for them. But I need to see them beat somebody that isn't Shopify, because Shopify just does kind of feel like a free win right now. So those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree or disagree on down in the comments section below. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 1. Player of the week, no surprise, it's going to go to Quid in the mid lane here for 100 Thieves. Played Ezreal mid and he popped off on it. It was one of those things where if you have one game that's really standoutish and you dominate and you're really good in that series, you're going to win player of the week. There's not that many, you know, games to go off of in terms of picking player of the week, not nearly as many in terms of different circumstances as they were in previous weeks. You might get to play up to 3 games in a week, but it's just a bit different. So Quid's going to get player of the week for me. Runner-ups, Tactical, obviously for Immortals. He was incredible in that series for them. And then APA was probably the best player for Team Liquid in their win over FlyQuest. So they're going to be my honorable mentions, but Quid is going to get my player of the week, you know, following up that MVP spring split really well, at least here in week number 1. And then my dud of the week in week number 1, unfortunately, is going to go to Fake God. I think you could give this to contracts as well. Hell, you could probably give this to anybody on Shopify Rebellion outside of Bvoy, and I would feel pretty good about it. But again, Fake God is just someone I'm concerned about. Drafting Rumble into Skarner 2 games in a row is disastrous, and then obviously he has the track record of he wasn't very good in spring. And so I am very concerned about Fake God, somebody who has been a channel darling here in the past. It's about time for me to, I'm not going to say give up on expecting performances out of him, but really expect him to break out. I don't think that's going to happen here on Shopify. So Fake God, dud of the week, Quid, player of the week. That's going to do it for my LCS vid here in week number 1. If you enjoyed, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only cover the LCS on this channel. We cover all 4 of the major regions every single week, as well as the NACL on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all